Good evening. I'm William Anthony Hay, the Interim Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, and very glad you can join us for this event in the school's Civic Discourse Project this season. This is really our second lecture and our third event. We had our annual conference last month, and we're very glad to have you joining us. Our theme this year is Civics, Patriotism, and America's Prospects. Tonight's speaker is a leading scholar and public figure on economic liberty in relation to America's political culture and legal affairs. Are we the people still in charge is his topic. Tim Sandefur has also been named by ASU to hold the Goldwater Chair for 2023 academic year, and he's a professor of practice in SCETL this semester. Now, this is the school's seventh year organizing the Civic Discourse Project for ASU and the Phoenix community and national audiences. And we're glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS for another season of recording the Civic Discourse Project events. They're all on the archive, events this year and before on their website. Episodes are broadcast in the spring of each year. And you can also go back through many of our past events through SCETL's YouTube channel and on our ASU website. And those include all of the lecture and dialogue events in the CDP from its start in 2017. Again, we've worked for 7 years to convene a high-level conversation in the Civic Discourse Project with single speakers like Tim Sandefur, dialogue events, and the annual conference. Together encompass a wide range of views, of academic and civic views. The intellectual diversity we feature tries to exemplify civic disagreement. We don't just talk about civic culture, we try and model it. And it also argues for the importance of civic discourse in American higher education and society more widely. This public project is an extension of SCETL's academic program, our courses, our curriculum, degrees, and student experiences that strive to recreate liberal arts and the great books with civic education. And I should add for this event that one of the academic degrees that SCETL introduced to ASU is an undergraduate certificate in PPE, Politics, Philosophy, or Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Now, quickly, I just want to say, coming up, we have Roosevelt Montas discussing the relevance of great books on March 21st, and Alan Gelzo on what the Civil War is really about coming up on April 4th. And separate from the CDP, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott will speak on China and Indo-Pacific security on the afternoon of Friday, March 22nd. So please do come out for some of our other events as well. But for today's speaker, Timothy Sandefur is the Vice President for Legal Affairs at the Goldwater Institute's Scharf Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation, and he holds the Duncan Chair in Constitutional Government at the Institute. His litigation focuses on promoting economic liberty, private property rights, and free speech in states across the country. And we're delighted that Sandefur holds the Barry Goldwater Chair in American Institutions here at ASU for this year. And that our school, SCETL, was selected as the host department for his stint as Goldwater Chair. The chair itself was established to honor Senator Barry Goldwater for his long and meritorious service to Arizona and the United States of America. Scholars appointed should be distinguished in the fields of political science, history, economics, law, or public policy, and share Senator Goldwater's principles of Americanism, individual freedom, free markets, and the free enterprise system. Tim rings the bell on all of those. I should add that public lectures are just one of the duties of the Goldwater Chair, along with teaching a course. And Tim is teaching a combined graduate and undergraduate seminar course on the American Dream and Economic Liberty. He's the author of 8 books, including most recently Freedom's Furies, How Isabel Patterson, Rose Water Lane, and Ayn Rand Found Liberty in an Age of Darkness, and Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man, along with more than 50 scholarly articles on subjects from Indian law and antitrust to copyright law. In his radio and television appearances, he's well known as Tim the Lawyer on the Armstrong and Getty Show on radio, and his writings have appeared in national publications including Reason, National Review, The Wall Street Journal, and The Objective Standard, for which he is a contributing editor. Now, to discuss bureaucracy and democracy, are we the people in charge anymore? Tim Sandefur.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. Believe it or not, the word responsibility, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, first appeared in the Federalist Papers. I think that's a very revealing fact. Our constitutional system was designed, first and foremost, to make government responsible to the people in both senses of that word. It should respond to the public's needs, but it should also be held responsible, held accountable for its actions, in order to protect us from the government. In fact, our Constitution was meant to balance two competing values. On one hand, we think the majority should be able to make laws because the citizens are best suited to address society's needs. But on the other, we know that the majority isn't always right, and that each individual has the right to be free, to pursue happiness without arbitrary interference from the government. We all learned in school that one way the Founding Fathers resolved these tensions between democracy and liberty is the checks and balances system, which separates government into different parts and then makes those parts cooperate or compete against each other. By forcing lawmakers to jump through hoops like this, hoops of different shapes and sizes, we help ensure that government imposes only laws that reflect meaningful public consensus, because only laws with a lot of public support can make it through all of those hoops. While the system isn't perfect, it does help prevent government from acting in ways that are ill-conceived or motivated by ignorance or prejudice or irrational emotion. And the checks and balances system is reinforced by accountability requirements. We hold regular elections where people choose members of Congress. The president is indirectly elected in a different way. And judges are chosen by the elected representatives but are not themselves elected, which gives them the independence that they need, as the Federalist Papers put it, to serve the people at the peril of their displeasure. That is, it ensures that judges can say no when voters make illegal choices. All of this machinery of checks and balances, or as its detractors today call it, gridlock, is probably the most ingenious and effective method ever found for protecting individual freedom. But today, the constitutional ideal of how a bill becomes a law appears increasingly mythological. Instead of elected representatives debating proposed laws and then voting on them, most of the laws that govern us are not actually laws at all, but are instead regulations or rules, which are not written by elected lawmakers, but by bureaucrats who work for administrative agencies. These bureaucrats are not elected and therefore not responsible to the public in any meaningful sense. Some of the pseudo-laws or semi-laws that these bureaucrats write don't even qualify as regulations. In many situations, a single bureaucrat can issue an order, or not even an order, just a kind of pressure or threat. We call these dear colleague letters or guidances. And these have the full force of federal law, more or less. These regulations, orders, and sub-regulations, however, often bear no resemblance to anything that any member of Congress, let alone any voter, actually had in mind. Consider the case of Mike and Chantel Sackett. In 2004, they bought land in a residential neighborhood in a town called Priest Lake, Idaho. There were homes on either side of their lot, and it was well suited for a house. And so it never occurred to them that their land, and let me emphasize that word, land, was actually a water of the United States. How naive they were. It turned out that across the road from their lot was a ditch through which water flowed from a nearby marsh. The water flowed for about a half a mile through that ditch before pouring into a creek. The creek then flowed for another third of a mile before pouring into Priest Lake itself. And the significance of this ditch became clear when the Sacketts had gravel poured on their lot in order to start building the foundation for their house. That's when a notice arrived from the Environmental Protection Agency. That notice, called a compliance order, was signed by a single bureaucrat, and it declared that they were polluting a federal waterway in violation of the Clean Water Act. What waterway? Their plot of land. You see, the EPA official was asserting that because their land was connected through the ditch and through the creek into Priest Lake, their land was a wetland. Now, the Clean Water Act prohibits anyone from polluting a water of the United States. It doesn't use the word wetlands, but the agency's bureaucrats have interpreted the phrase waters of the United States to include not just things that are obviously waters of the United States, like the Mississippi River, but also wetlands, which the EPA defines as, quote, areas that are so inundated and saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions, end quote. In fact, the EPA has gone further, asserting power to regulate what it called adjacent wetlands, which it defined as wetlands neighboring actual waterways. Now, under this logic, of course, the EPA could label practically anything a water of the United States that's wet, or sometimes wet. And I mean this literally. About 20 years ago, the agency adopted what it called the hydrological connection rule, which says that any time a drop of water might travel into a major river like the Mississippi through any amount of distance or through any amount of time, then the place it came from qualified as a water of the United States. Of course, every molecule of water on Earth can travel from any place on Earth eventually into the Mississippi River, which means that the EPA's hydrological connection theory would have subjected everything in the country to federal control. Under that theory, there's no logical reason why the urine in your bladder is not a water of the United States. Now, you might think it's silly that the federal government, which only has limited powers specified in the Constitution, limited to truly national matters, could claim power over your property simply because a duck happens to land there, and you would be right. But a few years before it created the hydrological connection rule, it created what it called the migratory bird rule, which said that even an isolated puddle would qualify as a water of the United States if migrating ducks or other aquatic birds flying from one state to another might stop for a bit to quack and waddle around. Fortunately, the US Supreme Court has repeatedly said no to these things. It struck down the migratory bird rule in 2001 and the hydrological connection rule in 2006, and yet the EPA keeps trying to expand its power. So, when the Sackett family tried to build their dream home in Idaho, it was a simple matter for a single bureaucrat to issue a compliance order declaring their property a wetland subject to federal control and declaring the Sacketts outlaws. The compliance order commanded the Sacketts to remove the gravel, replant the vegetation that they had cleared, and open their land to federal inspection at any time. And if they refused, they would be fined $75,000 per day. And the Sacketts were fortunate enough to get legal assistance from a nonprofit foundation, which took their case to the US Supreme Court twice. Last year, after a legal battle that took 2 decades, the justices unanimously declared that the EPA had overstepped its bounds. Now, I'm not here to talk about environmental law, whether the federal government should be acting as a nationwide zoning board with power over virtually any spot of land where water might seep or birds might cheep is a question that should be settled through the democratic process of debate, negotiation, and voting by elected representatives. But none of that ever happened in the Sackett's case. In fact, it's almost certain that a majority of Congress or a majority of the voters could never be found who, if asked, would agree that federal officials should have power to veto construction of a house in Idaho just because water from a nearby pond flows into a nearby ditch that flows into a creek and eventually into a lake. Yet that was the rule that was imposed on the Sackett family, and for decades, with the full force of the federal government. And it took what probably amounts to millions of dollars in litigation to reach the Supreme Court, where all of the justices said the agency had acted wrongly. This travesty is the result of what we call the administrative state. Bureaucracies whose employees write the rules, enforce the rules, and judge alleged violations of the rules, contradicting the separation of powers principle that underlies our Constitution, and all with a minimum of accountability to the public. It's no wonder that today millions of Americans are experiencing a growing sense that government is out of their control, that it has morphed into a sort of perpetual motion machine over which neither of the two principles I mentioned at the beginning, individual freedom or the will of the majority, have much influence. In some quarters, this anxiety has taken on a paranoid tinge, as when we hear people speak in conspiratorial terms of the so-called deep state, whose masters manipulate us from behind the scenes. But while that image is overgrown, it is a fact that the administrative state governs Americans' daily lives far more pervasively, far more intimately, and far more intransigently than anything Congress does. And yet, at the same time, it is not responsible to the public. Federal bureaucracy either persists from one administration to the next, stubbornly refusing to respond to voters' demands for change, or, what is equally troubling, it abruptly changes the rules of society based on a single stroke of the president's pen, outside of the legislative process. This is obviously a serious problem for our democracy, and it's not a partisan issue, or at least it shouldn't be. Recall the anger and fear with which many Democrats greeted President Donald Trump's drastic changes, or attempted changes, to federal rules regarding everything from immigration to environmental restrictions. For every Republican disturbed by President Obama's adoption of DACA, an immigration policy that he admitted was illegal but implemented anyway, without congressional approval, there's a Democrat who's troubled by President Trump's so-called Muslim ban. Neither of these involved any debate or vote in Congress. America's founding fathers never contemplated a system in which the president could unilaterally impose massive changes in the way we live our lives, yet that is today's reality. Congress has essentially outsourced lawmaking and shrugged off its responsibility. And it's not just a federal issue. Every state has its own administrative agencies, which often follow the same vague and biased rules at the expense of citizens. Probably the most astounding example is the case 2 years ago in which California's Fish and Game Commission declared that bees are fish. I'll say that again, in case you missed it. Ordinary honeybees are fish under California law. The reason? Well, California law allows the agency to regulate activities that affect fish, and it defines fish as, quote, any wild fish, mollusk, invertebrate, amphibian, or part, spawn, or ovum of any of these, end quote. Now, for many years, state bureaucrats have wanted to regulate activities involving bees, but they never got state lawmakers to go along. So, the commission came up with a brilliant idea. Since the list I just read you includes the word invertebrate, and bees are invertebrates, it simply declared that bees fall within the list of things that the commission is already allowed to control, that is, fish, and California courts went along with it. Again, we can safely assume that no Californian, not even their politicians, actually think bees are fish, or had that in mind when passing the law. How then could such an absurdity occur? And remember that as silly as this example might seem, it has severe real-world consequences. Under federal and state law, anytime an activity, whether it's building an office tower or simply changing the lot lines on a piece of real estate, affects a species on the list, that fact gives the agency virtual carte blanche to decide whether to allow the activity or not. The government can then impose permit requirements and financial demands that strangle development, bankrupt property owners, and even imprison people who violate the rules. When Michigan landowner John Rapanos moved a pile of dirt from one part of his perfectly dry land to another part of his perfectly dry land after the EPA had declared it a federal wetland, he was sentenced to 3 years in jail and $185,000 in fines. A decade ago, the California Coastal Commission declared that fireworks displays qualify as the development of land. The state's Coastal Act requires the commission's permission for any development, and it defines that word as, quote, the placement or erection of any solid material or structure, discharge or disposal of any dredged material or of any gaseous, liquid, solid, or thermal waste, grading, removing, dredging, mining, extraction of any materials, etc. And since a firework discharges a gas when it explodes, that is, smoke, the commission concluded that the annual July 4th fireworks show in the quaint seaside town of Gualala constituted development. And that was the end of Gualala's annual July 4th celebration, which was basically the community's entire tourism industry. Just months ago, the Biden administration, with the simple stroke of a pen, blocked oil and gas production on hundreds of square miles of land belonging to members of the Navajo tribe, thereby destroying development rights that could have helped provide a living for thousands of tribal members. Navajo Nation President Boo Nygren called the act, quote, beating up people in poverty. You gotta not have a heart if you're going to put people that are already impoverished in third world country conditions and barely have enough to pay for gas, food, laundry, the daily necessities, to put them into an even tougher situation, said Nygren. But nobody even voted on that decision, not least of all the Navajo. What does it say about American democracy that an unelected agency, sometimes just a single employee, can wield such extraordinary power? And is there any way to fix this problem? Well, just weeks ago, the US Supreme Court heard arguments in a pair of cases that involve some of these questions, and the judges appear poised to issue rulings that might help shift things in the right direction. I want to explain these cases in a moment. But first, I think it's helpful to appreciate where the so-called administrative state comes from. After all, it's not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, and America's founding fathers had virtually no conception of the bureaucratic agencies that oversee most of our lawmaking. The first federal administrative agency was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, created in 1824. And that origin suggests something important. The primary model of bureaucracy is the military. Its structure is one in which a commander at the top issues orders to those below. And that means it's particularly well adapted to controlling a colonized or conquered populace. This is one of the most important ways in which bureaucratic rule differs from the rule of law. The rule of law is premised on a reciprocal relationship between equal citizens. Bureaucracy, by contrast, establishes a top-down system of commands from a superior to an inferior. As philosopher Hannah Arendt put it in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, bureaucracy is governed by decrees rather than legislation. And the difference is that legislation can be traced to a specific legislator or lobbyist, but decrees are anonymous. They just emerge from the bureaucracy with nobody's name on it. Nobody knows who came up with the migratory bird rule. Also, decrees are less principled than laws, and this gives bureaucracy an image of flexibility and omniscience. The bureaucrat, wrote Arendt, who by merely administering decrees has the illusion of constant action, feels tremendously superior to the impractical people who are forever entangled in legal niceties and therefore stay outside the sphere of power, which to the bureaucrat is everything, end quote. Now, this makes bureaucracy well adapted to strongman rule. That is, dictators love bureaucracies because dictators inherently wish to organize society along the lines of a military order in which the people all serve the leader's desires instead of pursuing happiness on their own. Bureaucracy's seeming omniscience also tends to bewilder citizens and make them feel helpless in the opposition to the government. As Arendt put it, since the people bureaucracy dominates over can never really know why something is happening, the people become subject to an ongoing legalistic interpretation whose possibilities are endless, unlimited by reason and unhampered by knowledge. But while the administrative state began as a militaristic order, it evolved during the early 20th century. A true military system follows orders. Today's administrative state more or less writes its own orders, and that's because of changes that came about during the progressive era of the early 20th century. Heavily influenced by German philosophers such as Georg Hegel and Johann Fichte, progressive intellectuals rejected the classical liberalism of America's founding fathers, especially the doctrine of natural law, which held that all people have inherent rights which the government is morally bound to respect. In the founders' natural law theory, we create government as a kind of contract. We have rights, and we establish a system to protect those rights. But progressives considered this idea obsolete. They argued that we do not actually have any rights at all, or even any individuality. Instead, every person's consciousness, every person's identity, and all of our rights are actually social constructs. In other words, we don't create the state creates us. And that, in turn, means government does not have to respect us. It creates and molds us. As Professor Jerry Muller puts it, the Hegelians in the progressive movement thought, quote, "The great challenge of modern institutions is to provide us with enough choice to foster our sense of individuality while linking us up with others and with our cultural past to provide us with a sense of meaning and belonging," end quote. That was the ambition of the progressive administrative state. Americans would gain a sense of self by being manipulated in what they read, what they thought, and how they behaved. Consider the words of John Dewey, one of the most influential progressive thinkers. Progressives, he declared, quote, "know that the individual is nothing fixed, given, ready-made, but something achieved, and achieved not in isolation, but with the aid and support of conditions cultural and physical, including economic, legal, and political institutions, as well as science and art, end quote. Thus, he continued, government should engage in, quote, the positive construction of whatever favorable institutions, legal, political, and economic, would have a bearing, positive or negative, upon the growth of individuals, end quote. This, of course, is essentially a call for totalitarianism. Progressives hoped government would sculpt society in such a way as to shape the very souls of citizens. But if ordinary people needed to be shaped and molded, who would be in charge? If the people are too ignorant and biased to run their own lives, who will run our lives for us? The progressives' answer to that was technocratic organization. Fascinated by the mass production technologies that were brand new at that time, the progressives decided that if the right experts were put in charge, society too could be rationalized and systematized. They considered free market capitalism essentially chaotic and wasteful. If expert administrators ran things, people would no longer squander their money, and there would be no disparities between rich and poor. Instead, the right people would get the right things at the right time and use them in the right ways. This was social engineering, and progressives loved it. They imposed government control on everything from land use. They created zoning laws, for example, to keep racial minorities out of white neighborhoods, to laws against divorce or the consumption of alcohol. As Charles Edward Merriam, one of the smartest and most honest political thinkers of the era, wrote in 1913, "It is the state that makes liberty possible, determines what its limits shall be, guarantees and protects it. The state does not take away from civil liberty, but is the creator of liberty, the power that makes it possible." Merriam admitted that this was not what the Constitution said, but he added, modern political theory shows a decided tendency away from many doctrines that were held by the men of 1776. Well, that was certainly true. The progressives' desire for social control reached its height during World War I, when Woodrow Wilson's administration seized the nation's railroads, rationed the food supply, and implemented unprecedented bureaucratic management of public and private life. The 1920s saw a brief repudiation of progressivism, but when the Great Depression began, the progressive Republican Herbert Hoover and the progressive Democrat Franklin Roosevelt vastly expanded the reach of federal agencies. And since then, the history of the administrative state has been more or less a story of constant growth. Today, federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and there are at least 2.5 million of them in about 700 federal agencies, decide everything from the thickness of ketchup in fast food packets to the angle at which your office chair can recline. Now, as bureaucratic power grew, Congress began to change how it wrote the law. I've mentioned that progressives were enamored of the strongman theory of government. That is, they thought democracy tends to paralyze society, and that real progress requires a commander to simply impose his will. As Woodrow Wilson put it, quote, "Men are as clay in the hands of the consummate leader." Progressives therefore tended to favor laws that empowered the president to act unilaterally. A good example is the Antiquities Act of 1906. This law allows the president, by simply signing a piece of paper, to declare land off limits for development. Last year, President Biden used that act to forbid ranching, mining, or other uses of nearly 1 million acres of land in northern Arizona, even though the act was supposedly passed to protect specific small sites of archaeological interest, antiquity. Chief Justice Roberts has said that the Antiquities Act has been transformed into a power without any discernible limit, and he's right. Nobody in the country voted on the question of whether 1 million acres of Arizona should be effectively confiscated by the federal government. That was done by the unilateral authority of a single federal official. Because progressives thought administrative agencies could serve as the dispassionate, objective, scientific experts with the know-how to engineer society, they also favored laws that expanded and empowered these agencies. That, plus the strongman theory of government, creates an incentive for Congress to adopt legislation with vaguely worded goals, sometimes nothing more than slogans, and then leave it to the bureaucrats to figure out what those slogans mean. For example, the Natural Gas Act of 1938 gave the Federal Power Commission authority to dictate what prices businesses could charge for natural gas. It said the commission could establish just and reasonable rates. What is a just and reasonable rate? Whatever the commission says it is. And since the commission answers to the president, it's whatever the president says it is. The Communications Act of 1934 gave the Federal Communications Commission power to regulate radio stations as the public interest, convenience, and necessity may require. What does the public interest require? Your guess is as good as mine. More importantly, your guess is as good as the guess of some hired bureaucrat in a limestone office building in Washington, D.C. One might imagine that Congress would be reluctant to give away its lawmaking power to regulatory agencies. We normally assume, and the Founding Fathers assumed, that Congress would want to increase its powers rather than giving them away. But the truth is that Congress benefits politically from delegating its authority to others. Doing so allows Congress to take credit for solving problems when it merely passes the buck. And if the agency does the wrong thing, Congress can haul the offending bureaucrats before a committee and scold them in front of the C-SPAN cameras and still look like the good guy. In short, Congress's abandonment of its lawmaking responsibilities enables it to take credit for whatever good bureaucrats do and blame someone else for whatever bad they do. More importantly, this enables Congress to avoid having serious debates over complex issues, which explains the paralysis we experience on questions such as illegal immigration. Of course, the White House also benefits when Congress gives away its power because that expands the president's authority, which the president likes. And if anything goes wrong, the president can blame Congress for not giving him enough power and then argue that Congress should create a new bureaucracy to police the existing one. That's why we have multiple layers of bureaucracy. My favorite example of this is the Federal Office of Thrift Supervision. This is an agency whose job it is to make sure that other agencies don't waste money. I've always wondered who ensures that the Office of Thrift Supervision doesn't waste money. Who will bureaucratize the bureaucratizers? All of this might not be so problematic if courts were at least in a position to intervene and to enforce the checks and balances system against the other two branches, but courts have not been willing to do that. Since at least the 1930s, courts have used a variety of tricks to refuse to enforce the Constitution, when doing so is politically unpopular. And they typically rationalize this dereliction of duty by calling it respect for democracy. The word they use for it is deference. Rather than exercise their own independent judgment to decide cases, which is the job that judges are hired to do, they will often defer to the decisions made by other branches of government on the theory that we don't want activist courts. This term activist courts has always struck me as bizarre. The opposite of active is passive. Do we really want passive courts? The authors of our Constitution certainly did not. According to the Federalist Papers, one reason we have courts is to keep the other branches of government within their proper sphere. That is the opposite of deferential passivity. It's deference that allowed California bureaucrats to get away with declaring bees to be fish. If the agency says so, the California Supreme Court said, that's good enough for us. The issue of deference is the question that's now pending in the first of the two U.S. Supreme Court cases that I mentioned, Loper-Bright versus Raimondo. A particular type of deference that's at issue here is called Chevron deference because it originated in a 1980s case called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. The Chevron deference rule says that if a bureaucracy interprets a law, courts should defer to that interpretation. Of course, the problem is that it's always in the bureaucracy's interest to defend and expand its powers, and so when courts defer, that encourages agencies to grow more and more with virtually no meaningful limitation. Now to pause here to emphasize that the problem is not that bureaucrats are bad people. On the contrary, most bureaucrats are good, conscientious, hardworking people who strive to do their jobs well. When they're given the job of regulating in the public interest, they take that seriously, and that means that they read the scope of their power as broadly as possible. That's why the Supreme Court warned us 50 years ago that the Constitution, quote, was designed to protect the fragile values of a vulnerable citizenry from the overbearing concern for efficiency and efficacy that may characterize praiseworthy government officials no less and perhaps more than mediocre ones, end quote. The Loper-Bright case is a perfect example of the problems with the Chevron deference theory. The case involves fishing boats in the North Atlantic. Under federal law, the National Marine Fisheries Service, which we call by the fun-to-say name NMFS, is responsible for ensuring, that's what they call it, not my fault, is responsible for ensuring that fishing boats don't catch too many fish, which might make fishing unsustainable. And one way to do that is to put a federal agent on every fishing boat to monitor the crew and make sure they're following the rules. But these boats are not exactly cruise ships. They're relatively small, owned by small family businesses. And putting an additional person on the boat who's not helping catch fish, but who's doing paperwork and spying on you for the government, is an expensive as well as an annoying proposition. Now, a few years ago, NIMFS came up with a clever cost-cutting measure. Rather than paying for these inspectors out of its own budget, the agency adopted a regulation that forces the fishing companies to pay their salaries. Where did it get power to do that? Well, Congress never gave it express authority to impose what is essentially a new tax. And it wasn't just an oversight. There are other laws that govern other parts of the fishing business in which Congress does require private companies to pay for on-site inspectors. But no such requirement exists in this law. And that strongly implies that Congress intentionally withheld that power. But NIMFS told the Supreme Court in January that it has power to impose this requirement under a provision of the law that lets it, quote, prescribe such other measures, requirements, or conditions and restrictions as are determined to be necessary and appropriate for the conservation and management of the fishery, end quote. Consider how broad that authority is. The power to prescribe such requirements as are necessary. Necessary in whose eyes? NIMFS, of course. And when the fishing company sued, arguing that NIMFS was reading the law too broadly, judges followed the Chevron deference rule and said they were required to defer to the agency's position. Now, maybe it's a good idea to require fishing companies to carry a federal spy along with them and pay for it out of their own pockets. And maybe that's a bad idea. But one thing is clear: the people's elected representatives never voted on such a thing. The problems with the administrative state aren't limited to relatively obscure questions about fishing inspectors either. Bureaucratic agencies have the power to impose rules, but also to investigate alleged violations of those rules and hold hearings where they punish people they claim violated those rules. And the consequence is that in many cases, Americans are deprived of their constitutional right to a fair trial. That's the issue in the second of the administrative law cases before the court, SEC versus Bureaucracy. There, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the buying and selling of stocks and bonds, accused Mr. Bureaucracy of a kind of fraud. Now, if it had filed criminal fraud charges against him, like you see on Law and Order, he would have been entitled to a jury trial. But the agency didn't want him to have a jury trial. So, instead, it accused him of a regulatory violation and imposed an enormous financial penalty, which it called civil instead of criminal. By relabeling its criminal fraud case as an administrative civil case, it can force Mr. Bureaucracy to go through a so-called administrative hearing instead of a trial. But the ordinary rules of evidence and procedure that apply in the courtroom, rules against hearsay, for example, do not apply in administrative hearings. And where a judge in a courtroom is supposed to be neutral, these administrative hearings are not presided over by judges. They're presided over by employees of the agency itself. Right? So simply put, in an administrative hearing, the prosecutor is sitting in the judge's seat. The results can only be described as a Twilight Zone satire on the principles of justice. Even in the rare case where a person wins in an administrative hearing, the agency can ignore that and simply override that decision. Here in Arizona, for example, state law often allows agency directors to ignore decisions by administrative judges and declare people guilty anyway. In one recent case, an employee of a juvenile halfway house who was assaulted by a minor and defended himself was accused of using excessive force. He demanded a hearing, and he introduced testimony and evidence, and the hearing officer ruled that he had been wrongly accused. Yet the head of the Department of Child Safety was not happy with that. Even though he had not heard any of the testimony himself, he overrode that ruling and declared the man guilty, placing him on the state's do not hire list and effectively banning him from jobs in his chosen career. Now, you might be wondering, if administrative power is so dangerous to liberty and so contrary to democracy, what could be the argument in favor of it? In fact, the administrative state does have its defenders. One of these is Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule. He and others argue that bureaucracies are really inevitable. All laws, they say, contain some degree of vagueness which can only be resolved by executive decision-making, and that's all these agencies are doing. For example, Imagine that there's a law that bans vehicles in your local park. What qualifies as a vehicle? Does that include bicycles? What about electric scooters? At some point, a police officer will have to decide whether to ticket someone who's riding a bike or a scooter in the park, and when he does so, he's engaged in the same kind of discretion that the EPA is exercising when it decides what a water of the United States is. They might make the wrong choice, but this kind of line drawing is really unavoidable. Now, the problem with that argument is that today's administrative agencies enjoy far more power than does the policeman in this example, and that authority is expanded even more by the deference rule. When a cop tickets someone for riding a bike in the park, the bicyclist can go to court and argue before a judge that bikes aren't vehicles. That works because the judge exercises her own judgment about whether or not something is a vehicle, and that acts as a check and balance against the executive branch. But when a judge defers and just accepts the police officer's say-so, that eliminates a crucial element of our constitutional protections. What's more, there is a vast difference between a law that bans vehicles in the park, but there's reasonable dispute over what qualifies as a vehicle, and a law that allows nymphs to prescribe such measures, requirements, or restrictions as are determined to be necessary. In the park example, there's a disagreement over the definitions within a rule that the legislature has prescribed. But in the Loper-Bright case, the agency is not enforcing, it's prescribing the rule. And that violates a basic principle of our Constitution. John Locke, the philosophical father of the American Revolution, said 4 centuries ago that we voters give our representatives the power to make laws, not to make lawmakers. Professor Vermeulen goes even further in defending the administrative state. He argues that in America today, law has become largely obsolete, and he thinks that's a good thing. He quotes the 17th century philosopher Francis Bacon to describe his own view of proper authority. Law itself has decided to bow to the administrative state, Vermeulen says, to leash itself, in Francis Bacon's image, under the throne. Now, this is a quote from a speech Bacon gave in 1617, in which he urged English judges to, quote, show their stoutness in elevating and bearing up the throne. But however fitting such an idea might be for an absolute monarchy, the authors of our Constitution rejected that idea. They preferred the ideas of Bacon's arch enemy, the great lawyer and judge Sir Edward Coke, who despised Bacon's under-the-throne notion and insisted that the king and his ministers are subordinate to the law, not above it. In fact, when Coke rejected the idea that judges should support the throne instead of the law, King James I removed him from office, and an image of that confrontation is sculpted on the bronze front doors of the U.S. Supreme Court building. Our founding fathers believed, in the words of John Adams, that the judicial power ought to be distinct from both the legislative and executive and independent from both, that it may be a check upon both. It's no surprise that America's founding fathers, who valued judicial independence so much, made no reference to deference in the Constitution. On the contrary, they separated the judiciary from the other branches in order to prevent what the Federalist Papers calls the judge's improper complacence with executive or legislative actions. Now, the good news is that people across the political spectrum seem to be waking up to the danger of this under-the-throne notion. In fact, many judges and lawmakers have started to repudiate the foolhardy deference doctrines that are endangering our lives, liberties, and property. The Supreme Courts of Wisconsin, Mississippi, and Kansas recently threw out their deference doctrines, holding that judges should exercise their own judgment when deciding legal questions. Courts in Delaware, Wyoming, Utah, Michigan, and Ohio did the same years ago. And in recent years, the Arizona legislature eliminated deference doctrines in a series of laws that have made our state a model to follow for anyone still devoted to basic constitutional principles. First, Arizona adopted legislation that rejects the idea of deference in the interpretation of laws. Judges, not hired bureaucrats, should decide what the law says. Second, Arizona also adopted legislation that repudiates the idea of deference when it comes to factual questions. Not only should judges decide legal questions for themselves, but when somebody's charged with violating the law and asks for a court hearing, he should be entitled to have an unbiased, neutral judge view the facts for herself. Third, Arizona adopted the Right to Earn a Living Act, which declares that any time a bureaucracy restricts people's economic freedom, the bureaucracy bears the burden of proving that that restriction is actually necessary to protect the public from a genuine risk. In most states, the reverse is true. If an agency blocks a person from pursuing his or her own chosen profession, that's presumed legitimate, and the person must prove that it's not. And since that requires you to prove a negative, and that's logically impossible, it becomes practically impossible for people to overcome bureaucratic power, no matter how arbitrary and unjust. Fourth, Arizona lawmakers adopted legislation called permit freedom, which governs how permits or licenses work. Think for a moment about how much of what we do requires some kind of government pre-approval. Everything from building a house to starting a business to buying a gun to protect yourself. Whenever the government requires you to get permission before you do something, that gives government extraordinary power to demand conditions or to procrastinate as long as it wants. So, decades ago, the US Supreme Court said that government must follow 3 rules whenever it imposes any permit requirements. First, the requirements for getting a permit must be stated clearly, not vaguely. Rules that say you get a permit for good cause, for example, are too subjective. And that's dangerous because it allows government to demand whatever it wants from you. Basic principles of due process require that government's rules be clear and unambiguous. Second, the government must establish a clear deadline that says when you will get an answer on your permit application. Bureaucrats should not be free to tell you, well, we'll get around to it, and then effectively deny your permit simply by delay. Third, if you're denied a permit, you should have a right to go before a hearing, to have a hearing before a real judge who in order to challenge that denial and argue why you're entitled to the permit. These are not burdensome requirements. They're common sense rules that, as I've said, the Supreme Court already requires. Yet they are routinely ignored by state and local governments across the country. Just last year, however, Arizona passed and Governor Hobbs signed legislation that implements these common sense reforms, imposing clarity and deadline rules on permits throughout the state. These are healthy developments, and at a time when Americans are more anxious than ever about the future stability of our democracy, it's crucial that we confront the powers of bureaucracies that threaten both democracy and liberty. Today's administrative state bears no resemblance to the conception of lawmaking held by the Constitution's authors. Not only do today's more candid defenders of the administrative state admit this, but those who created the administrative state admitted it at the time. President Wilson, one of the greatest champions of federal bureaucracy, wrote in 1908 that the Constitution's authors constructed the federal government upon a theory of checks and balances which was meant to limit its operation, but no government can be successfully conducted upon so mechanical a theory, end quote. He thought checks and balances, quote, have proved mischievous, and that it was indispensable that government enjoy, quote, large and powers and unhampered discretion, end quote. Now, the history of the past century shows how not dangerous such a naive, if not wicked, faith in the goodness of government power can be. We usually think of bureaucracy as a nuisance, as a money-wasting inefficiency, but the experiences of the 20th century, when totalitarian regimes used bureaucracy to commit some of humanity's most horrendous crimes, demonstrates that it is also among the most dangerous things human beings have ever invented. America's founding fathers were aware of that danger. The government they created divides and limits power in order to protect freedom, to ensure that we can all enjoy our lives, liberty, and property and safety. And key to that system is the principle of responsibility. I mentioned when I began, the word responsibility first appeared in the Federalist Papers. That book's authors explained that the Constitution aimed to keep citizens safe from the government. The ingredients which constitute safety, wrote Alexander Hamilton, are first, a due dependence on the people, secondly, a due responsibility. James Madison agreed. Elections, he said, are no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. And among those additional protections is a court system which will enforce the Constitution against the other branches to ensure that they keep within the limits assigned to their authority. Our administrative state stretches far beyond those limits today, and I submit stands as the single largest threat to the blessings of liberty in America today. Fortunately, we already have the tools that we need to push back and to ensure that the government of the people, by the people, can preserve those blessings to ourselves and our posterity. Thank you very much. Yeah, the question is, wouldn't the founders refer to this issue that I've been talking about as the non-delegation doctrine? Yes, that's right. So I'm not sure that they had the term non-delegation doctrine, but that is the correct legal term for what I've been describing. The non-delegation doctrine is best known from Supreme Court cases dating to the early 1930s, when the U.S. Supreme Court said that that Congress cannot delegate its authority to a subordinate agency or to some other entity. The question then arose, what is delegation? And it got into some line drawing problems, and for that reason, the court backed away from that precedent very quickly. And there have only been two, I think, Supreme Court cases on the non-delegation doctrine. And the court has largely just left it sitting there. And what I've been talking about deference to agency power and things, those can be treated as a separate issue, but they do overlap. And really, the biggest problem is the delegation. The biggest problem is because if you didn't have the delegation, questions over legal interpretation would be, relatively minor, I think. Certainly compared to the vast power that these agencies have to write rules, and they do so through a process that's set forth by statute, where the public is supposed to be able to comment on them. But you submit a comment, and all they have to do is think about it. They don't have to agree with you, disagree with you. They don't have to. They just have to read your letter. It's basically like a letter to the editor column. That's what the statute requires, So this is, yes, the answer is, I've been mostly talking about the delegation problem, which is really the major problem in this area of law.
Yeah, so I was kind of reminded of basically FDR's adversarial relationship with the Supreme Court, at least initially. And do you think that's sort of, more of that is sort of what's called for?
Forgive me, whose adversarial relationship with the Supreme Court?
FDR.
FDR. Yeah, well, so yeah. This is one of the great stories in American history that early on in the New Deal era, there was this back and forth between President Roosevelt and the Supreme Court. And eventually the Supreme Court backed down. And by the time he died, of course, Roosevelt had named, I think, all but one of the justices. And the court had largely abandoned the legal doctrines that it had developed in the previous decades to protect us from overreaching government. The story is sometimes told a little bit too cartoonishly. You often hear the phrase, the switch in time that saved 9. The way the story goes is that in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt proposed the infamous court packing plan. And that because they were afraid of that plan, the Supreme Court backed away and said, okay, well, never mind, we won't strike down laws as unconstitutional anymore, and that all went away. That's really kind of a crude way of looking at it, because the court had been retreating from protecting us against overreaching government for a few years already by that time. 1934, 2 years before, the Supreme Court had largely eliminated some of the most important legal protections for economic liberty and private property rights. Nevertheless, it is the case that between 1930 and 1940, the decade that W.H. Auden called a low, dishonest decade, during that decade, the Supreme Court largely washed its hands of its responsibility to police the boundaries of the three branches. And it was really only in more recent decades that they've gotten more interested in that in a halting and hesitant way. Of course, absolutely what we need is a court system that is willing to resist the president or Congress when they do things that might be very popular but are unconstitutional. Unfortunately, even with the current Supreme Court, which I think is, relatively speaking, a pretty good court, even there, you find a great deal of reluctance to actually do that. Some of the conservative justices are interested in pushing back against federal power in some respects, but not in other respects. Some of the liberal justices is exactly the opposite side of that. And so what you end up getting is that you get all the federal power instead of all the resistance to it. Yes?
Yeah, I don't know if I get the phrase right, but John Locke, who I love your quote from, thank you, said you could never really control an empowered population, an educated population. We've grown up in that environment. Well, don't fight City Hall, you can't win. In effect, we've been disempowered to fight for a lot of our own rights because it would cost you 50 times more and take you forever. Do you see, if you start reversing more and more of that chevron, that it may, in fact,
So the question is that there's...
You get a trend that locally you actually may feel, gee, I could challenge this.
You're right. The question in my paraphrase is that there's sort of been this loss of morale among the American people when it comes to fighting City Hall when it does something wrong. And is it possible that some of that spirit of resistance might revive if the Supreme Court shows some gumption? Well, to some degree, the answer is yes, because courage feeds off itself. And I think when people see other people stand up for principle, it will irritate half the people, but it will embolden the other half. I mean, we know this from all of our daily lives, and we know it from movies. I always think of that scene in High Noon, you know, where Gary Cooper's walking down the street all by himself. You know, there's a commentary on how when one person does something brave and principled, it inspires other people to stand up also. So to some degree, I think yes, if the court is willing to put some real teeth into what the Constitution actually says, I do think it will inspire people. On this, I'll digress to say, I always thought it was funny that we use the term living constitutionalism to describe a legal philosophy that is actually the opposite of that. It's a legal philosophy that is really dead constitutionalism, that fills the Constitution with all sorts of dead spots. Take the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says that government cannot tear down your house and give it to a Costco just to build a shopping mall to make some developer rich. That's a public use clause of the Fifth Amendment and the eminent domain provision. And yet in the Kelo case in 2005, the Supreme Court said, no, that's perfectly fine. We're not going to be activists. We're going to step back. How is that living constitutionalism? That's killing constitutionalism is what that is. So I do think that if we saw more principled leadership from those in office, we would see more resistance. That said, I think I do need to be fair to the other side ideologically, which is to say that these are not always simple questions. Sometimes these are very complicated legal issues. The text is sometimes ambiguous. The fine points of technical law over how many parts per million of lead should be allowed in the river. These sorts of things. Those are complicated issues, and so I don't want it to be too cartoonish and say, well, the court's just doing everything wrong, you should do everything right. The point is that even when you step back from those complicated issues, it's undeniable that under the doctrines of deference that both the left and right have adopted in the legal community, especially in the past 50 years or so, those doctrines of deference have disarmed the courts as one of our three equal branches of government, and as a result allowed the problems I've complained about, Congress giving its power away to the president, and the president basically ruling unilaterally. And the stunned looks on the faces of some of these Congress members when the president does something, they're like, oh, we're not going to allow him to do it. And then the president goes, well, I'll do it. And then they're like, why, that's shocking. Well, don't you read your own laws? Anyhow. Yes?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that you open with what's now called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'm really curious because the progressive movement doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
They respond to certain crises that aren't being handled locally and that aren't being handled by the states, particularly racism and issues of Indian affairs. So I'm curious if you could reach back. Did the founders fail to recognize this? Could they have prevented it with a constitutional tweak or two? Or is this something that we can only sort of correct in hindsight?
This is one of those questions where no matter what answer I give, it's going to be too broad, and there will be so many exceptions and fine points that I will not have time to address. You could do an entire book. In fact, I sort of did write a book about this. You should all pick it up. It's called The Conscience of the Constitution, wherever fine books are sold. You know fine books are sold there if they sell my book. So it is true. Of course the progressives were responding to crises of their time, as every generation does, and I'm enough of a Jeffersonian to think that that we can no more expect one generation to live by the dogmas of a previous generation than to expect a child to continue wearing the clothes that fitted him when he was a baby when he grows up. But the real problem that progressivism reflects is not just an effort to address the problems of the day. The real problem, the poison pill that progressivism caused the country to swallow were these philosophical doctrines that I mentioned that abandoned the principles of individual rights. And in large part, this was done by a trick of rhetoric that I fear you yourself slipped into in your question, when you refer to how the progressives are trying to address issues that were left unaddressed. Well, it was not by accident that these things were left unaddressed by our constitutional order. The great discovery of classical liberal political philosophy, which is found in the first sentence of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, is the distinction between government and civil society. The recognition that there are social problems, many, in fact, an infinite number of social problems that are very complicated, that cannot be solved by a one-size-fits-all rule, and that have to be solved in the realm of civil society and not by government. That idea that these problems do need to be solved, but they need to be solved in the private realm through contractual agreement, through private charity if you're talking about the poor, through bargaining if you're talking about working conditions and all these sorts of things, that idea reflects a conscious choice and a correct choice by the framers of the Constitution to say government is not good at solving these problems. Most of these problems are too complicated to be solved with the blunt instrument of government, and they can only be solved in the realm of civil society. It is extremely unfortunate, perhaps the most unfortunate legacy of the New Deal era, that we Americans, as the previous question asked, have largely lost the capacity even to imagine the possibility of solving these problems in the realm of civil society. We see a social problem, we think government needs to solve it. It's almost a reflex. It's like hitting the knee with a hammer, and it's like, government needs to solve this problem, as if government is made up of angels who aren't affected by all of the flaws inherent in private individuals. Jefferson says in his first inaugural address, have we found angels in the form of kings to govern us? What he means by that is, let's assume that the progressive critique of capitalism is correct, that corporations are greedy and evil and stupid, that people are so inept in running their own lives they can't possibly make the right choices, etc. Let's assume that's all true. If you assume that's all true, why in the world would you trust them with power over other people? Right? Classical liberalism is not an optimistic vision of human beings that says they're all good, if only they had freedom they would do all perfect things. Classical liberalism is a pessimistic attitude toward human nature. It says human beings are indeed wicked, corrupt, foolhardy, ignorant. They have all these flaws, and that's precisely why they cannot be trusted to run other people's lives. And so you have to limit the use of coercion and limit the use of the state with constitutional principles, and then say, you're not allowed to use coercion against each other. Now go solve your own problems. That was a conscious choice by the framers of the Constitution, and that was precisely the choice the progressives rejected. And they did it in a number of different ways. One of them was to call the Founding Fathers naive and foolhardy, to just ignore the fact that they knew what they were doing. Wilson and others say, well, all that stuff's just obsolete. Science has taught us now that we can shape and mold society through the government, et cetera, et cetera. And now, in fact, what has happened is we've learned a lot of things about how bureaucracy works in the years since then. Two things that are particularly of importance. One is the knowledge problem, and the other is the rent-seeking problem. The knowledge problem, which is most associated with the economist Friedrich Hayek, is the principle that nobody knows how to run an economy. Nobody. Nobody even knows how to run a single business. I can kind of see some people in the audience, this is the light, it's kind of hard to see you, but I think there are some people in the audience who are as old as I am and remember New Coke. Remember New Coke? The Coca-Cola company thought in the mid-'80s that Americans actually wanted a new flavor of Coke, okay? And they devoted millions of dollars to developing and unveiling their new Coke flavor. They hired Bill Cosby, the nation's most beloved entertainer, to be their ad guy, right? And it was a huge flop. Within a few months, it was such a humiliating failure that the Coca-Cola company had brought back the original recipe Coca-Cola because everybody hated the new Coke so much. Now, if the Coca-Cola company doesn't know how to sell sugar water, right? Why in the world would you assume that a bureaucrat whose paycheck does not depend on getting the answer right is going to get the answer right? That's the most important thing you can know about government, is government gets paid even when it makes the wrong decision, right? If I go to Taco Bell and I order a burrito supreme and they give me, a hard shell taco instead, I don't pay them. I go to Del Taco instead. If government gets it wrong, I still have to pay them. I can't start a competing government. I can't refuse to shop there, right? So why would we trust government more? So the knowledge problem is the observation that nobody can know the future. Nobody can know all of the details that go into even producing a simple item. The most famous example of this is the essay I, Pencil by Leonard Read. He points out nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody. To make a pencil, you have to have wood, right? You have to have graphite. You have to have an eraser. Well, to have the graphite, you have to have a graphite mine, so you're going to have to hire miners to work in your graphite mine, and you're going to have to feed your miners, so you're going to have a restaurant to feed your miners, and you're going to have food for the restaurant, so you have to have cattle to make the beef, to feed the miners at the mine for the graphite, for the pen. You can do this sort of reasoning to show that the entire world's economy is involved in developing a pencil. Nobody can organize all of those behaviors to build a single pencil. So you cannot reduce these things to bureaucratic regimentation because of this knowledge problem. That's the first big problem with bureaucracy. The second big problem of bureaucracy is the rent-seeking problem I mentioned. Rent-seeking is an economics term. It means lobbying, right? And lobbying is a very simple phenomenon to understand. Why does lobbying occur? Because people expect to profit from it. That's why lobbying occurs. Now imagine, here's a thought experiment. Imagine I'm the government, right, and I'm going to tax you all $1. And just to make this easy, let's assume that there's 30 people here. So I have $30 that I've taken from you all in taxes, $1 each, and I'm going to give that $30 to one of these 3 people here. Now, in the following days, they're going to take me to lunch, one on one day, one on the next day, one on the third day, to persuade me to give them the $30. And the question for you is, how much are they going to spend on my lunch? Less than $30, that's right. It's simple gambling odds. You take your jackpot, $30, and divide it by your chance of winning, 1/3. So these 3 people are going to spend $10 on Monday, $10 on Tuesday, $10 on Wednesday, in their effort to persuade me to give them the $30. Because if they spend more than that, then over time they'll lose money. Now, how much are all of you going to spend to persuade me not to take $1 from you? 99 cents, right? Each of you is going to spend 99 cents to persuade me not to take $1 from you, right? So I've got all these people taking me out to lunch, and the rest of you aren't even showing up at city council meetings, right? Because it's not worth it to you. It's not worth it. Right, the federal dairy industry or the federal corn industry that gets all these enormous subsidies, when you do the math, it comes out to a tiny fraction of a penny when I buy milk or corn at the grocery store. So I'm not going to Congress to lobby against these subsidies. But the companies that receive the subsidies, they stand to gain millions of dollars. So they devote a lot of energy to lobbying the government. The point is that when there's government wealth redistribution, it creates this ratchet effect called rent-seeking, or concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. And the result of that is a spiral of constantly growing government, because the taxpayers, they stand to lose so little that they don't bother complaining about it. And by the way, that's why election day is November and tax day is April. Make sure you forget about it by the time the election day comes along, right? So you have this ratchet effect, and that rent-seeking results in the following. The repeat players get the money from the system, not the most deserving. The people who are going to gain more from wealth redistribution are those who know how to obtain the government's favor, not the people who most morally deserve the benefits of government largesse. So with those two observations were things that the progressives did not know about because they were discoveries of 20th century economists. The second one is best known from the work of James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, who won the Nobel Prize for it. Those observations were unavailable to the progressives. They at least had the excuse that they could imagine that somehow government was an angel. It was unaffected by the rest of us and could therefore plan our lives accordingly and do it right. Because goodness knows we can't. Right? So that's the problem with saying, well, progressivism evolved because there were all these problems that were going on. And so, well, some of those problems were perfectly well understood by the Founding Fathers, who certainly had problems of their own, but they also understood that there were tremendous risks in handing over the solution to those problems to government power, because government power is subject to these incentives and these influences that make it extremely dangerous. And the most dangerous of all is the magical utopian thinking of assuming that government bureaucracy is immune from the weaknesses that affect us ordinary people, us sneetches with no stars on our bellies. Sean, sorry about the long-winded response, but it's been building up inside of me for oh so long.
I'd like to return to the first question on the non-delegation doctrine. As you alluded to, the courts have only officially done that a couple of times. There have been some recent concurrences where they've discussed it. They also have more recently, though, been doing the major questions doctrine, saying that we're going to at least be more demanding that Congress does these delegations. Do you view the major questions doctrine as basically something on the trajectory toward a revivification of non-delegation, or do you view it as sort of a more cautious substitute that will foreclose it instead?
My goodness, what a question. How many lawyers we got in the audience here? See, how technical can my answer be? Okay, so the major questions doctrine is this rule that the Supreme Court announced some time ago that says, and rationally so, it said, you know, when Congress passes laws, it doesn't tend to hide big things in tiny places. As the phrase goes, they don't hide elephants in mouse holes. In other words, when Congress writes a law, it's probably not going to write some innocuous phrase that it actually intends to be a big deal. Oh, we're giving Congress this enormous new power, but we're going to be kind of quiet about it. They don't usually do that, or at least the courts are going to presume that they don't usually do that. So when an agency comes to court and says, well, it turns out, Your Honor, they allow us to regulate bees because they're actually fish, the court's going to say, well, you know, if the legislature really intended to regulate bees, they would not have hidden it in this little innocuous list of what fish are, right? And so that's the major questions doctrine, is the rule that if it's a major question, we're going to make the agency prove to us that the Congress really did intend for the agency to have that kind of power. If it's a big power, that requires them to really prove that Congress had this in mind. And this doctrine has been kind of growing in the past several years. And the courts have been kind of getting away from this Chevron deference rule by using this major questions doctrine. And here's how it works. So, you know, NIMPS shows up and it says, well, you know, we have this power because of the regulation. You've got to defer to us about what the rule means. And the court says, well, no, because this is a major question, and we don't presume that Congress intended this in this way, right? And so you don't even get it. You don't even talk about the deference. And that's been happening a lot lately. It's been happening so much that during the arguments in the Loper-Bright case back in January, the government's lawyers kept saying to the justices, don't worry about Chevron deference. It's all dead anyway. You haven't done a Chevron deference case in forever because nobody uses that doctrine anyhow. It's all about this major questions stuff. And that's enough to solve the problem. To which Justice Gorsuch had the best answer, which was, then why are we even here? Right? The Loper-Bright case, the court below decided it based on Chevron. It did not say, oh, this is a major question, so we don't defer. It didn't do that. It said, Chevron deference, so we're required to take NIMPS at its word. Right? So that shows that this principle is still out there. Do I think that the major questions doctrine is going to expand or retreat? That is truly, totally up to the justices. That is one of those things where these doctrines are so mushy, they're so malleable, for one thing, because they're never mentioned in anything like the Constitution or anything like that. They can basically do whatever they want. So I wouldn't even venture to try and answer that part of the question. I think I see another question over here.
Maybe time for one more. Thank you so much. A question about civic education, which is what our school does, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. To be fair to the progressive point of view, one would want citizens to say, I've heard your argument, and I prefer this new movement beyond the separation of powers. And to be fair to the separation of powers, one would want citizens to know that this was a bedrock principle. The philosopher behind it, Montesquieu, right, says that what if he would say, if he were put forward in time, right, what a federal agency can do by being lawmaker and executive enforcing and judge is the definition of tyranny in the spirit of laws, right?
Exactly.
It's the unification of those powers, and
Right.
it says there can't possibly be. So we would want citizens to know, but there's a very poor situation of civics education. The Goldwater Institute invests some time and effort in this, but would that be helpful? I guess the Supreme Court, in its opinions, can do some of that work, but if citizens aren't educated enough to care about Supreme Court opinions, if Justice Gorsuch writes about Chevron deference being wrong because of the separation of powers, how will it be received? So we're in a bit of a you know, a bad downward spiral on this.
No
so
question.
what are your thoughts about it?
Two things. The first, I should make a preliminary note and say I've been speaking about early 20th century progressivism, people like Woodrow Wilson and others. Progressivism has evolved, obviously, in the century after that. And I didn't talk at all about that. One of the most important transformations or alterations of progressivism came in the 1960s with a huge change in how progressives thought about themselves. One of the purposes of the progressive movement in the late 19th, early 20th century was an attempt to divorce politics from morality and to have an expert political system that was not concerned with questions of justice, injustice, right and wrong, which many of them considered irrational. And the result of that, of course, was things like segregation, which was also invented by 20th century progressives. The 1950s and 1960s saw a lot of progressives retreat from that idea and started reinserting the idea that politics has to have a morality to it, and that came back. The best book that I would recommend on early 20th century progressivism is Michael McGurr's book, A Fierce Discontent, which is a very nice introduction to the history of the progressive era. Another outstanding book, one of the best books I've ever read in my life, is written by a pro-progressive guy, a guy named Louis Menand, M-E-N-A-N-D, called The Metaphysical Club. It's a history of the philosophy that kind of underlies the progressive movement, that is the philosophy of pragmatism. So I would recommend you take a look at those books if you want a little bit more detail about that. As far as the education of the citizenry, I'm totally with you, man, totally with you. The Supreme Court, all it can do is write opinions. And if people aren't going to read those opinions, and if they aren't capable of understanding those opinions, then what can the Supreme Court do? And it's a farce, the way legal issues are reported in the media. When I read about a court decision in a newspaper or magazine, the degree to which the reporting is just factually wrong is astonishing to me. It's time after time, these reporters get not just, I mean, they get the basic facts wrong. They get the names of the parties wrong. How many of you in here, and this is a highly educated crowd because you're here to see me, how many people in here think George W. Bush was the plaintiff in Bush versus Gore? Yeah, good. Because a lot of people think that, right? I mean, the reporting is of such poor quality that people think that like Bush was the plaintiff in Bush versus Gore and things like this. It's just astonishing. So all that the Supreme Court can do is write their opinions and hope that people will explain what the opinions say. And the media have not been doing that for a long time. There are good resources out there. The National Constitution Center has great resources. There are plenty of podcasts, websites, and places you can go. It takes some work because you got to sit there and read stuff. Sometimes my job is to read these things, and it bores the hell out of me sometimes. You know, I understand. But if you don't do that, what you are doing is you are allowing the media to tell you what the justices said, and what they are saying may have no relationship to what the justices actually said. And it's very typically in just in blanket terms of winners, losers. Oh, well, the Republican justices voted for this or that. And that honestly breaks down terribly. The Republican justices often vote with the liberals, and liberals often vote with the conservatives, and so forth. So you cannot reduce it to this black, white, this team versus that team kind of approach. It doesn't work. So please read the opinions and take advantage of the many resources out there for understanding them. Last question.
Yes. Are there any legal commentators you would recommend? For instance, I'm thinking of Alan Dershowitz or Jonathan Turley.
On Supreme Court decisions generally,
Yeah.
My favorite resource are the guys who write for the Volley Conspiracy. The Volley Conspiracy blog, which is run by Reason Magazine now, they cover a lot of this stuff. It's a large group of law professors and legal intellectuals. They write about it in an accessible format. The National Constitution Center podcast is another good resource. So yeah, I think I would. And of course, the Goldwater Institute provides a handy breakdown of Supreme Court decisions and doctrines, all accessible and all 100% correct. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate you coming out.